On today's program, political commentator and leadership expert David Gergen. He served as White House advisor to four presidents of both parties: Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. He's professor of public service and founding director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. In addition, he serves as a senior political analyst for CNN and works actively with a rising generation of new leaders. He's out now with a new book called Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. In the book, whose title is borrowed from a speech given by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Gergen pays homage to leaders past and present, from pathbreakers like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, John Lewis, John McCain, and Harvey Milk, to historic icons like Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Winston Churchill, and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Many of the fundamental questions about the nature of leaders are addressed. How are leaders made? What role do the followers play in the efficacy of a leader? What, after all, is leadership itself? Gergen says it's time for new blood, new ideas, and that the old ways have not always worked, or often worked. But in a society as fragmented and increasingly tribal as America in 2022, where's the case to be made for widespread optimism, and who is carrying the torch? Well, to discuss this and much more, David Gergen joins me now. I'm pleased he's doing so. Welcome.
Daniel, it's good to be here with you, and thank you for that kind introduction. You captured extremely well much of what this book is about, and you teed it up well. So I appreciate it. I know you've got a terrific audience, and we probably won't spend much time talking about classical music, but I do respect very much the fact that you're a concert cellist and play like 200 times a year across the country, which is amazing.
Well, thank you. And hopefully we'll get to music a little bit, because it may be our last unifier, as I sometimes call it.
Absolutely.
But as you address in the book, the central question of why, but maybe tell us, for those who haven't read it yet, or may not have a chance to read it, why this book, and talk about how long you had been thinking about it.
Well, I did serve in the government for much of my professional life, but in 1999, something over 20 years ago, my wife and I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I took up a post at Harvard as a professor of practice, as they call it. I'm not an academic, but they kindly invited me to come in. And after I got there, I was asked by the dean if I would help began a new center on leadership, on public leadership, which I agreed to spend 3 or 4 years doing that. And I wound up devoting about 20 years to the project. But it was very much an attempt to see if we could not only recruit and attract young people into public service, but we wanted to train them. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into preparation of people for leadership. It's not something you're just born with. You really have to develop it. And it's for many organizations, starting with the military in the United States, the leadership development is a prime objective of those organizations so that they can succeed. All of which is to say that I've had the privilege really of working with the younger generation that's coming up. And in contrast to the pessimism that all of us share with regard to our national life today, it's sort of a dark period, I think, that we're going through. We've seen these kind of things before, and we have, as John Meacham, the historian, good friend of Walter Isaacson's, points out in his writings, we've faced perhaps one could say 4 existential threats as a country. The early days of the Republic, when George Washington almost lost. He lost 6 of his first 8 battles, and the people trying to put together the revolution, almost failed. They almost died for it. But we had that threat. We then had the Civil War. I was just out on the battlefields of Gettysburg over the weekend, and Gettysburg remains I think one of the most moving areas of our country. When you see how many people died there in these fields, it's just unbelievable. But then we also had the Depression, the Great Depression, and finally we had an existential threat in the Second World War. it wasn't always obvious that we would survive the Second World War. Certainly, the UK was on its back heels when we got in, and the Japanese were a powerful force. So, but what Meacham's point is, and I think is a good starting point, is that in the 4 times we've really been challenged with our very existence, we've come through it 3 out of those 4 times. We've done pretty well. We have a pretty good track record of getting through crises. Abigail Adams wrote famously to their son, John Quincy Adams, when he was a teenager, that great moments of peril bring forth great statesmen. And frequently in the midst of these threats, people arise who become leaders and can attract major followers and change history. We're no better example these days than Zelensky in Ukraine. He's made all the difference with his, coming out of the entertainment industry. One would not expect someone to have that kind of gravitas, but he has, and I think he's proven that really good leaders can make a difference in the life of a country, the life of a society. So what this book is all about is it's a clarion call to the young people I've had an opportunity to work with over the years to come into the public arena, to stand up and fight for making us a better country, for getting us through this series of crises that we've been in for the last years. And the book is also a guidebook, a practical guidebook for how to succeed if you're trying to become a leader. What are the steps you have to go through, and what are the what are the developments you ought to be looking for? And leadership starts from within. I'll come back to that. But those are the purposes of the book. And in dealing with it, one has to confront the fact that we have an existing generation and the baby boomers who have been in charge of the country now for these many years. Going back to the early 1990s. And it hasn't worked out well. We have some terrific people who are baby boomers, who are wonderful leaders, but as a culture, we haven't come together, and the leadership, I think, has been disappointing in the long run. And so from my point of view, it's time to pass the torch. We should not be electing a new president who's going to be in his 80s or maybe her 80s. When they get elected, you just can't handle it from there. Listen, I'm just turning 80. I can speak from experience. You lose a step, and you're not as reliable on memory. You're not as reliable on judgment as you are when you're younger.
Well, you seem pretty good on memory so far.
I'm faking it.
You're not 80 yet, I guess so.
No, I've got a couple of days left. Yep, thank you. But nonetheless, what I do feel is that it's irresponsible to place people in the presidency when they're 80 years old. You just don't know what you're getting. It's a complicated world we're living in. It's extraordinarily complicated, and what we need is more of the baby boomers to gracefully leave the stage. That's not that they can't contribute mightily. They can as mentors, they can as employers, as buddies, as friends, there are different ways you can serve people. You can serve in your community. There are a lot of things you can do in community, but the leadership of the country really ought to be passed now to the up and coming generations, the millennials and Generation Z. And we ought to be preparing those generations for service. I happen, and I'll come back to this, but I happen to be a big believer in national service. I think every young person ought to be encouraged to give a year back to their communities, and if possible, 2 years. And we then ought to trade in so that if you do a year of service, you get a year of your tuition debt knocked off. And we ought to do it. And so you can earn your way out of these tuition debts, and you can begin. And frankly, if you do service, as I discovered going in the Navy after law school, if you're going to meet with people who are very different from you, and you're going to have to learn how to get along. And what I found was a lot of the people I met, especially when I came out of the Navy and had worked with a lot of enlisted people, there were so many young people who were enlisted who had dropped out of community college, they hadn't finished college, but they were first-rate human beings, and they really cared about the country. And I think we owe them more respect. And we respect our military veterans, but we need to create veterans of civic life. This book is a lot about how and why we should do that. And some of the examples that you cited, that we ought to. We don't have a lot of role models these days, but there are some. Kay Graham, I read about because I was very close to Kay for a period of time. And it was a wonderful relationship. John McCain, I knew not so well, but I just thought he was a first class leader. I think that John Lewis, I'm someone I had a chance to spend time with. And again, I think a wonderful person. So there are individuals like that are coming up, but I think we need a lot more like them. And I think that's a matter of focusing and training people and developing incentives for people to say, yeah, I'd like to come and give a year back, 2 years back. And maybe later in life, when I finish my first career, maybe I'll come back and work in a nonprofit and put in 10 or 15 years ahead. We have some wonderful people running our nonprofits. So that's the essence of it. I'm sorry to be so bloviated.
And not at all, but you mentioned a lot of things. I want to cover a few
Sure.
of them. First of all, go back to the 4 existential threats that you talked about via
Yes.
Nietzsche, and talk about the sort of leaders we had during each of these existential threats and contrast them with perhaps the kind of leader we have or don't have today, if indeed there is an existential threat going on today. Certainly,
Well,
certainly there must be more than one.
Well, the remarkable thing was in each of the existential threat periods that were so challenging to America. The first one was during the days of the New Republic. And we had leaders, leaders who sprang forth in the way that Abigail Adams had been talking about. I'll come back to that. Then in the Civil War brought forth Lincoln. And many of the people who came around that group, and John Hay and Nicolay, for example, who were his assistants, went on, especially John Hay, went on to really significant service to the country. And then you move on to the Depression and Second World War. FDR was central to both those things. So who would have thought? And then after he came down with polio, the most feared scourge of his time, who would have thought that he could have brought that kind of leadership? But he did. But it all goes to this larger question. And Warren Bennis, who was the leadership guru and a dear friend who's passed from us now, I'm afraid, but he used to ask this question: how is it that when we were a country of 3 million people back in the days of the early republic, that with 3 million people, we could produce 6 world-class leaders: Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, Franklin, and Madison. We had 6 world-class leaders, population of 3 million. Today, we have 330 million people plus. And we can't find one leader who is world-class. We have a hard time stretching for that. Where are our Zelenskys? It's a really big question. I'm not sure we know the answer, but I do think we've substituted celebrities for heroes.
But do you have a theory? Where are our Zelenskys? Are they in the private sector? Are they playing a flute in some symphony instead of leading a state? Cello. Well, I didn't want to say that, but are they around? They just don't want to do it, or has the
it's a good question. Some are discouraged. It's hard. And, when I go out and speak to young people, a lot of people ask me, well, this sounds good, but I've got a huge amount of debt. I have to pay my bills. I've got a young child at home. It's hard enough during the pandemic, and just to keep a roof over our heads and keep bread on the table. And now with inflation, you got $60 gallons of gas or car full of gas and that sort of thing. It's really hard. And what can I do? And the world seems so big and I'm so small. Well, first of all, my own experience, Daniel, is that there are a lot of young people who would like to make a difference. And I see 2 streams that are pretty steady these days. One stream of people coming back into the country, back into our workforce, are the veterans who've been serving in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They remind me very much of the World War II generation. They really want to make a difference. They come back and with the World War II, the World War II people sort of stripped off their military uniform, put on civilian clothes, and went out and tried to save this country. And we had a really marvelous group. That's one of the best generations we've had. So I see a lot of people today. One young man who was a student in my class, and went over and he had a couple of tours And then he came back after 3 years overseas. And what did he do? He joined up with Teach for America. And he spent 2 or 3 years in the classroom. And then he ran for Congress. And unfortunately, he ran 2 hard races in Trump country, and he got whipped. But he would be a wonderful congressman. I hope he stays. His name is Dan Feehan. But I see people like that all the time now who are coming through, who really do want to make a difference, who think this is their moment, and it is their moment. The second group, and it's a very diverse group, but you look at people who started Black Lives Matter, or who started, the Me Too movement. Who were they? They were basically young Black women who were in their 20s and 30s. Black women increasingly occupy the moral high ground in this country, and we don't celebrate them enough. But if you just look at the Stacey Abrams of the world, who are emerging in Georgia, they're really important figures. I don't agree with their politics like AOC. She's much more liberal than I am, but I really respect her for getting in the arena and fighting for what she believes.
But you're hitting on something. You're hitting it. Stay on this point for a minute. You're hitting on something crucial, which is that you don't agree with her, but you respect her. Yes. And this is not a statement that we should just pass by lightly. This is a crucial thing. In music, we often have a disagreement, and you say, well, I really don't like your musical idea, but I respect you. I respect the spirit behind the idea, but I can't agree with it myself. In society, we have an amazing lack of ability to say I respect them, but I fundamentally wholly disagree with them. And so what you said maybe sound like a part of a bigger thing, but that's an important sentiment in itself, isn't it? Something that we're losing.
Yes, we've stopped listening to each other. Once you get sort of you want to know who somebody is, you check out in about 2 or 3 things, and 2 or 3 sentences in, you say, oh, I'm not going to get along with that person, or this is going to be hard. That people who are conservative now, when they move their housing, almost invariably go to neighborhoods where people who are conservative reign, where that's the large part of the society. And similarly, people who come from urban areas, tend to go into off to the left, and never the twain shall meet. So we've come a long, long way to becoming divisive. What I'm trying to argue is that in really divisive times, when you're really threatened, we tend to rise. Our history we've risen up to the occasion. We've risen to the challenges. And that's the point I'm trying to make. That's what I'm trying to encourage the young people to gather to themselves. And you've got to be patient. You've got to be persevering. You've got to be courageous. You've got to be thoughtful. You've got to be empathic. You've got to have all these different traits. And they're not easy to have. And people are going to make mistakes. But above all, you've got to be committed to the notion that this is a better country and can be a better country than we have been for the last 15 years. We're on an unsustainable path right now. And it's very dangerous. I've compared it to a car being driven along the side of a cliff in the middle of the night with no headlights and a driving rainstorm. After a while, you can go off the cliff. And we're doing that to ourselves on the environment as it is. But who are the people who most want to save the environment today in this country? It's young people who want to do that. Who are the people who are trying to stop the gun violence? It's people like Parkland and David Hogg and people like that who came through that. I think one of the things that is very apparent is that with the new social media, you can get to the top faster. You can attract a following faster than you could have others. AOC would never have done and gotten to the level she's gotten to without having social media. But it's also true that social media is a two-edged sword, and it can be used to slay. So when people get to the top, it's easier to get to the top. It's very hard to exercise power at the top, and it's really easy these days to fall off, to slip off, because a lot of people want to do you in, and they don't want you to succeed, and they want to treat you as an enemy. And that's the danger point that we're in right now.
Well, you mentioned 15 years. So
yes.
Let's say roughly 15 years. What has been happening over the past 15 years? 15 years takes us back to 2000, what?
Well, listen, I'd go all the way back actually to 1992 or so.
Okay.
That's when the warrior generation, World War II generation, essentially gave up major power. We had 7 presidents in a row, from John F. Kennedy through George H.W. Bush. 7 presidents, different parties. All 7 wore a military uniform. All 7 gave back to their country when they were called. In 1992, we turned back on the World War II generation basically left the halls of power, and we turned it over to the baby boomers. And Bill Clinton, I've been friends with Bill Clinton for years and years, and I think the world of him. But with that group that came in with Clinton, but especially, if Clinton came in 92, if you look at Newt Gingrich, he came in 94, and that really began to change our politics. And of the presidents, with 5 presidents we've had since early 90s, not one has worn a military uniform. One, George W. Bush, to his credit, was in the reserves, but it's not quite the same. Depending on the great state of Texas from the state of Oklahoma is not quite the same.
So when you talk about wearing the military uniform, what do you think it does other than perhaps add a level of commitment, pre-commitment to the country, and also a level of gravitas?
Yeah, sure. It's good. It's a good question. I do think that the discipline that comes from being in the military, I think that the importance of team building. You can't survive in the military unless you can build a good team. The importance of learning how to lead others. Listen, I came out of 2 elite schools, undergraduate life and then law school. And then, as I mentioned earlier, working with 50 enlisted seamen on a big ship was one of the best leadership schools I could have ever gone to. And when I was in the Navy, I was asking lawyers. I thought I might go practice law, but I wasn't sure. But almost to a person, when I asked leading lawyers, should I be an officer in the Navy, or should I be a legal eagle? And they said, to a person, they said, no, go be an officer, much better experience. And if you go study the law, it'll take us 2 or 3 years to unteach you from all the dumb things you've learned in the Navy. I actually had an interview with Richard Nixon, who was out of office. He'd been beaten a couple of times. He came through the fall into Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was studying, and I was called in to have an interview with him. And the World Series were on, and he'd look at me and ask a question, and I'd start to answer. And he'd look over at the TV set and watch the World Series while I was answering every time. It sort of turned me off going into the law. When I left, I said, by the way, what's the score?
Now, speaking of Richard Nixon, you talk about Charles de Gaulle here, and I'm just going to read a little bit here, because Nixon introduced you. You must have been a very young man at this point. Nixon,
I was.
Introduced you to the memoir by de Gaulle, Edge of the Sword. And de Gaulle wrote, quote, "A leader must know when to dissemble, when to be frank. He must pose as a servant of the public in order to become its master, and only after 1,000 intrigues and solemn understandings will he find himself with full power."
Yes.
End quote. Well, that doesn't sound like the most benevolent, perhaps likable qualities in a leader, but
it's right. What does it say? It comes straight out of Machiavelli, doesn't it, in many ways. Human nature being what it is, we've had recurring periods when we've had leaders like that. And de Gaulle was ideal for Nixon, but if you were a small d Democrat who believed in democracy, de Gaulle was too much of a one-man show. It was too close to authoritarianism, and especially the way de Gaulle could dismiss anything. The ends justified all the means for him, and that's what Machiavelli was all about. The ends justifying the means, and I think de Gaulle is not de Gaulle, to give you access to the press question. I believe that the President of the United States in a democracy must be answering to the press frequently, because you don't have to go up and answer questions as you do in a parliament. Well, de Gaulle had one press conference a year, one, and he demanded you submit the questions before he had the press conference.
Hmm.
Now, we would never stand for that today, but there's a temptation in that direction that you find in a lot of leaders today, because during the process of the order breaking down, the process of us becoming so divided, we've dropped a lot of our what's acceptable behavior. That is, we sort of define deviancy down, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, and I think that's dangerous for us. It's sort of truth now seems to be whatever you can get away with. If something happens, bad happens, the White House press secretary goes out there, they try to come up with an answer people will believe in. But if they can't stir the public with, they give some other answer. And they keep looking for answers that people will then be on their side. It's not a search for truth. It's a search for, who can we get to genuflect to us?
Well, is there a way out? What's the way out?
The way out is to have and to encourage the young people of the country. There's not enough room in the U.S. military, nor should we. We don't need a militarized country. But what we do need is something that's the equivalent of giving back to your country in the military. What can you give back to your country and your community? And the urban environments in which we find ourselves, there's so many drugs, there's so much mental illness now. We need people who are coming out and saying, this is unacceptable. We're simply not going to, we're at a real pivot point. We can either keep on going the way we are and we're going to screw this up royally, or we can change. And I think the best hope for change is in the younger generations. I am not at all confident we're going to change a lot in the next 2 or 3, 4, 5 years. But I'm increasingly hopeful that we can change over time. And I don't think it's out of reach.
David Gergen, when you say we may screw it up royally, what does that mean? What would the royal screw up look like in the United States or the world?
Well, it shouldn't be forgotten that Lincoln calls us the last great hope of mankind. And what I think what we're looking to is, can we get more people, and these can be of any age, who come into public service, committed to trying to change the way we live with each other, to move it toward a more respectful hearing, to bring forward the kind of people who are going to make a difference. Can we elect a Congress? I'm very involved with an organization called With Honor. It was formed by a young man who was a student of mine, who also then he started a program when he was at Chapel Hill as an undergraduate in Kibera in Kenya. It was in the slums there. It was called Carolina and Kibera. But when he came back out, when he finished college, and he went in the Marine Corps, and then he came out and went to business school and the Kennedy School. He started this group called With Honor 6 or 7 years ago, and I happen to be chair of the board for it, the advisory board. And the notion was to identify and then recruit and train and prepare people coming out of the military to run for the House of Representatives on both sides of the aisle. And we supported some 20 who were elected two cycles ago, and 10 were Republicans and 10 were Democrats. But everybody who came in that way had to sign a pledge that they were going to work in a bipartisan way. They would work with people across the aisle, and they have by and large kept to that. And you're seeing there's a caucus now in the House called For Country, which is an outgrowth of With Honor, in which people who are actually in office, and there are Democrats who are in that group. Seth Moulton, for example, is a student of mine. We're very close. He ran as a Democrat, and he's a military veteran, 4 tours in Iraq. But also there's a Mike Gallagher on the Republican side, PhD out of Georgetown. Just a wonderful young man, and he's exactly the kind of Republican you want to see. He's principled, he's thoughtful, he cares about the country, and he's reasonable. You can reach people like that. And instead of this craziness we now have, that you can't be seen with somebody across the aisle. Liz Cheney, I just believe, deserves huge laurels for her courage in standing up. I bet her father's really, really happy with her.
How many people are reasonable in this country? Speaking of reasonable, I mean, we're led to believe maybe not many, but maybe there are more.
More
I
than
mean,
more than people
you
think.
you
More
know,
than people think.
Heidi Heidkamp has been on here with me a few times, and
Yeah.
she's made the point that she used to win races in North Dakota 65%. She doesn't think she'd get more than 40% now. She says she
Oh, I
hasn't
think that's
moved
right.
anywhere.
Yep.
It's amazing, but she says, I always at least try to have arguments with Republicans, or at least in the past tried, but she doesn't anymore, with Republicans and
Yeah.
Democrats. And then she always say we go
Yeah.
all hang the Christmas lights together
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah.
That's reasonable.
Yeah, it is reasonable, and we all bemoan the fact that civic culture is disappearing, and it's you can just feel it. If you've been around for 10 years, 20 years, or a long time as I have been, it's more and more obvious. But at some point, I think we're going to snap back. I think the resistance to this craziness is growing, and people don't want to have their kids go through it. They don't want to have their kids run for office because it lessens them. And we're not we're going to pay a heavy price unless we snap back. And I think the young get that. They understand better than those of us who are much older. They're the ones who are going to pay the price for the environment. You play a lot in New Orleans. New Orleans has changed. The whole country has changed around New Orleans. New Orleans was after Katrina. It's never fully recovered from that. And that's we should not be willing to accept that we can't rebuild this country. We can. I personally, I think, by the way, there are some opportunities internationally. I would love to see, when the dust settles, when it's safe to do this, to have an international Peace Corps to go into Ukraine. I would love to see a call go out all across the democracies of the world to come sign up and spend some time in Ukraine. And let's show the world that we can rebuild it. I think we can.
Let's talk about music briefly, because as you know,
Yes.
David Gergen, everybody on here talks about music in some way or another. You happen to be very passionate. We were chatting earlier about mutual musician friends of ours and things like
Yes.
that. So music is a big part of your life, right? And what does it do for you? And what are your musical, I don't know, tastes? What do you love?
Well, I have really enjoyed this. I'm not trained in classical music. I wish I were. I was just something that I should have done a long time ago. But I have had people who are in my classes. I had Damien Wetzel, for example, in my class. He was a dancer for the New York City Ballet. And as his legs were giving out, he came to the county school. He got trained up, and he's now president of the Juilliard School. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Or you say take Henry Timms, who came out of, who's now running Lincoln Center. Or take Deborah Borda, who was, we mentioned her. All of those people came through the work that I've seen and gotten to know them. I'm most interested right now in a woman named Doris Sommer, who is a Harvard professor, and she works on Romance language. She comes out of Romance languages, but she has been working in the area of, if you bring culture to a city, and she's using Columbia now as a demonstration site. If you bring music to the city, and if you have various kind of cultural events going on, that the anger drops, that the level of disgust drops, and people start coming together. And she's working on a whole sort of notion of, can we, and in our evolving cities, can we introduce culture and music more fully? Can people live off that? And I think what she's finding, she has a conference coming up she's put together in the next few days. And what she's finding is that the introduction of culture really can help. It gives something unifying. We used to give some medals to cities that were doing really innovative things, and we gave a big prize once to this was Ford Foundation, gave a big prize to Chicago as a city. And the operation there was a summer program for kids with art. And they did a lot of painting, and they got instruction in art and that sort of thing. Then they went out and painted the buses of Chicago, and they painted a lot of the benches, the park benches there. And it livened the city up. It made it, and you could see these kids. Some kids came from very elite families, and some kids came out of the out of the worst situation. But they worked with each other. It's just like in the Second World War. When you had a Saltonstall from Massachusetts saluting a Polish kid from Brooklyn, the world was good. because there were people look past the skin color, they look past what your zip code was, they look past whether you might have gotten in trouble with the law. They look, can you do the job? Can you help get this done? And people did work things like that. Jimmy Carter has shown that with all of it, the Habitat for Humanity. You can really change people's minds about this. There's a guy named Eboo Patel in Chicago who's got he's a Muslim, and he has been finding ways to bring people from different faiths together, just as people going to different cultures can do that. So I think that it's just hard. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's just hard to accept that mankind is destined to go down this road much farther than how far we've gone down already.
Well, you mentioned music being able to help us. I was in Guatemala recently, and I played in Guatemala the cello suites of Bach there, and I'm sure there were many people, who had never heard solo Bach on the cello there. They were kind of stunned, but I think the certainly reaction and the appreciation and the feedback I got was extraordinary. And there's no need to have a musical education or an expertise or experience with classical music, because I think the music's so powerful that it speaks for itself and it connects to anybody. I
totally agree with you. Then the question becomes, how do you get people into an environment where they have a chance to hear it? And that's why I think, going back to the national service idea, the whole idea is to get people who are in rural America to come live in urban America for a year or two, and people in urban America to go live in rural America for a while, and get a sense of what it is like to be poor and in rural America, or fairly hopeless, or you've got the mental problems that are growing up and all the rest. I think people that get exposed to that want to change it, and they want to be proud of what their generation does. They want to be able to look back 30, 40, 50 years later and say, we made a difference while we were here. And I think we can do that. I'm a passionate believer we can do that, but we've got to get moving. We've got to sort of say, what are the steps we can take that would make us a better people, that would help us to elevate? How do we teach our kids? I think we're worried way too much about what they're teaching kids about sexuality or systemic racism, and what we ought to be teaching our kids: what are the possibilities in life? What are the positive things you could be doing? You could be John Lewis, but understand what John Lewis had to go through. You could be John McCain. You could be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You could be, the Wendy Copps of the world. There are some wonderful people out there who are role models, but if all we do is talk to each other about how awful things are, we're not going to make it out of here. We got to have some people. We need a Kennedy-like charismatic figure whom we trust. We learned that Kennedy, when he had the Bay of Pigs, and it was worse. It was terrible his first year, just really terrible. But he went out and told the truth about what happened, and that was when he famously said, defeat has victory has many fathers, but defeat is always an orphan. And I take responsibility for the defeat here at the Bay of Pigs. It was my mistake. I take responsibility. You know what happened? His popularity went up 10 points because people thought he was being honest, and people thought he's in this for us, and that sustained him through that period of time. People forget that President Kennedy, he was a strong Democrat, no question about it, but he had a Republican to serve as a Secretary of Treasury. He had a Republican to serve as Secretary of Defense. He had a Republican to head up the CIA, and he had a Republican to run his national security team out of the White House, where they had all the political conversations you can imagine. But that's the way we held together as a people. We had people like Kennedy. We had the Martin Luther Kings and others who came forward, and it made a big difference. And we need those people again. And we need the press has got to give them a break and let them have a day in front of the American people, not before they start tearing them down. I remember so well when Colin Powell, when it was reported out properly that Colin Powell was thinking about seriously about running for president. The columns that came the next 3 to 4 days after that were not about what Colin Powell could potentially do for the country. The columns always asked the question, what did he do wrong in Vietnam? Where did he get it wrong in Vietnam? And you can't let people, if people are going to rise, you've got to have some level of appreciation for what they've been through.
There's so much I'd like to go back and talk about. We don't have unlimited time, but just
Sure.
On another sort of semi-related note. So let's say you were with these 4 presidents, 4
Yes.
different people, both parties. I wonder if there's anything sort of personal that you can share about any of them that would be interesting or illuminating. I mean, just the idea of being around Nixon, okay, Ford, Reagan, Clinton, widely different people. What sort of personal things? I mean,
yeah. Well, let me just
shed some
say this
light.
about Nixon. Nixon was the best strategist I've ever met in public life. He metaphorically, he'd go up on a mountaintop and look into the past. And as Churchill said, he who can see farther back can see farther ahead. And Nixon had a very, very good sense of what was coming over the horizon and was able to rise to that. Had that been all there was to Nixon, he would have been one of our better presidents. But of course it wasn't, because he had demons inside him, Daniel, he had never learned to control. And they eventually sort of did him in. His leadership does start from within. You've got to get it right inside yourself. You've got to be able to lead yourself before you can serve others. And service is what leadership is all about. So you have this guy Nixon who's very, very divided. And I had a conversation with him, the same guy. I had a conversation with him shortly before he died. It was like 3 or 4 weeks before he died, and he called me and wanted to talk. And I thought he was going to, he would give me a soliloquy about all the great things he'd done as president. But he wanted to talk about something else. And it was when he was elected to Congress in 1946, just after the war. He came back, took off his military clothes, got into civilian clothes, ran for Congress, was elected to Congress with a Republican wave. He was a Republican then. Therefore, Harry Truman, the Democrat who was president. Truman, just in the next years that followed, saw that Europe was coming apart and proposed the Marshall Plan to help save Europe. Very expensive, but the most citizens of the country were exhausted from war and all the blood and all the treasure that had been spent, and so the Marshall Plan only had 18% support in the first Gallup poll. But Nixon was drawn in by Truman. Truman asked him if he'd come in as a Republican, working with the Democrats, see if they could do something bipartisan. He, along with other Republicans, a number of them, worked with the Democrats, and they got a bill that both sides could support. And Nixon said one of the proudest moments in his life, came when the Marshall Plan was put to a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. And he, Richard Nixon, young Republican, stood up to support the Marshall Plan. And there across the aisle, another future president stood up to support the Marshall Plan, John F. Kennedy. And Nixon said, the point is, when the chips are down, we stand up together. And that was for all of his flaws, which were many, it represented an approach to civic life that was slipping away from us. And we have to keep reminding our young people what it can be. What is this out there that's inspiring? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a tough road. I mean, I don't think the next few years are going to be easy at all. They can be very rough. But when this is over, I think we have the makings of rebuilding the country.
The makings of rebuilding a country. Well, I hope you're right. I hope we don't have to rebuild too much.
I agree.
As a young person, I look at what my generations had to go through, as you outline in this book, and look at all the things and the fact that we wake up one day and the world seems completely different, upside down than the day before even. And so here we are, doing the best we can. I think your case for civic engagement is very convincing. I think it may be one of the ways out. And I have the book right here, which is Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. David Gergen, so much more to talk about. Yeah, please.
Can I talk? I'll talk to Sam. I'm glad. I want to circle back to the beginning.
Good.
You said that the title of the book, and you were right, is attributed to Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.
Yes.
Just a brief story. Holmes grew up in a very prominent family in Boston. His father was a big doctor, and there was lots of money. So when Lincoln issued the first order for volunteers, first request for volunteers, Holmes could easily have ducked. A lot of people who were rich ducked. Teddy Roosevelt's father ducked, for example. But instead, he signed up for the Massachusetts, I think, 20th Regiment. And he decided, he was 23 years old. He decided to put his life on the line for the country and volunteer. He was grievously wounded 3 times in battles that followed. The last time he was left for dead. He really had a very, very tough time surviving and getting back up on his feet, but he did. He survived. And 20 years later, Daniel, he gave a speech Memorial Day, looking back from the eyes of his generation about what the war had meant to his generation. And he said, you know, it is up to man to take part in the passions of his time, lest he be seen as less than a man. And he went on to say, in our times, our generation, we had who fought. We had our hearts touched with fire in the war, but it was one of the greatest things we did, and it has been with us all our lives, that we did something noble. And I really like that, hearts touched with fire, because I do think we have to have more than policies. We have to have inspiration. We have to have some passion about what it is we're doing. The policies are fine. They're easier to come up with. To get big things done, as we should be doing, we need to have some sense of a celestial fire.
Well, maybe the answer is looking back to people like that. If we can't find them right now, maybe we need to read a few quotes and get inspired.
Absolutely.
Inspires me. And David,
yeah, go play more Bach. That will help everybody.
I plan to do so, and I hope there's a next time for us to talk. This has been fantastic.
Thank you.